another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing great, Jody. I'm doing great, and I'm excited because we have another esteemed guest here with us. Hannes from Oeksound is here with us. Welcome to the show, Hannes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you because we like your products so much.
Yeah, Soothe is on every single episode here to primarily take care of my lisps and things, so to make us sound like we know what we're talking about. But yeah, so seriously, thank you for being here. We do like your product. And for those who are not super familiar, perhaps, with your company and who you are, perhaps you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and what you do.
Yeah, if we start off with myself and my background, my name is Hannes Andersson. I'm hailing from Helsinki, Finland. I have a background in music as a musician, spanning back to playing piano when I was 8, played classical piano 10, 11 years, and then moving on to playing band instruments. You know, we all listen to heavy metal in Finland, or we all listen to heavy metal in Finland.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, at some point picked up band instruments and I started playing like progressive metal and stuff like that on bass. And at the same time, you know, because we're not shy of trying out different genres, I started singing a cappella. And then after that, because you have to play progressive rock metal and sing a cappella at the same time.
As you do.
Yeah. And after that, went on to study music technology at the Sibelius Academy over here in Helsinki. And actually at the Sibelius Academy, that's where I met Olli Keskinen, who is the founder of Oeksound. And he was the one to actually create the first version of Soothe pretty much on his own. That first version that he released, like there was no one else than him then, and we were studying together. And then he had released Soothe. We were both teaching in schools, and at the same time we had access at the academy, at the university. We had access to these amazing €1 million studios. You had your Sheps microphones, you had your DPA microphones, and you had the best possible musicians in the house, and we were recorded them. And then, I mean, on the side, we also taught music technology to teenagers maybe, and
that's awesome.
And so in music schools, and there, of course, you had the €200 interface and a microphone that maybe cost €100.
Right.
And so that difference in level was really apparent, but both of the sides had the same problem, resonances, and where those resonances come from. So that was kind of like a starting point for Olli. The idea of Soothe came from that, both from what we did on the side and then what happened in school, how we were taught that pro engineers would sometimes go in and automate EQ and find resonances that way and audio suit on stuff. That's pretty much just like the origin story of myself, and then also how that led up to jumping on Oeksound.
That's pretty interesting. Just as a quick side note for those of you who are not of Finnish descent, Sibelius is the last name of a famous Finnish composer. Say that 10 times fast. It's rather interesting that there's a university named after him. As the first thing that jumped in my mind was, wait a minute, the software company has a university, but it's the other way around, essentially. Or it's just a software company that decided to use his name as well, since he's a famous composer from your neck of the woods.
Yeah, of course. And Sibelius is so huge name over here, and it's historically means a lot here, and that's why a lot of us are classically trained at a young age. So we go to music school and we pick up an instrument, and maybe we play for 1 year, 2 years, or in my case 11 years, and still play, of course, but not with a teacher. I think a lot of us go through that same upbringing here, which means that we're pretty musical here and savvy when it comes to that musicality and theory and composers and that, but mainly on the classical side and not really as the Swedes on the pop side.
Or the metal side, as you described.
Yeah, and also very much on the technical metal side, exactly.
Yeah. There's a few interesting things there that I just kind of want to point out. Obviously, I grew up in Sweden, just like we mentioned on the podcast several times. When I grew up, and I know I'm dating myself here, we actually did have music as part of the curriculum when we went to school. Was that the same for you, Hannes, as you were in like grade school and stuff? Did you have music, or was it just ingrained in the culture so that
Yeah.
everybody was doing it on the side?
It's both. Yeah, we did have it in the curriculum. It was not as heavy there in
Right.
grade school, but definitely a lot of us did it on the side. Like many of us did go to music school on the side, and probably singing in church when I was 4 or 5, and then I picked up kantele, so our national instrument, the box with strings on it. Like picked that up when I was 6, and
Nice.
and went to like these groups where you have just 26-year-olds just playing kantele together, and got to get that upbringing on my side.
Right. It's really cool because I think smaller countries that we both grew up in, there's such a rich heritage of music that is there, and it's so ingrained in the culture. You mentioned Sibelius and things, and people often joke about Swedes, but oh, ABBA, ha ha ha. Yeah, but look at what they did, and look how many prominent musicians and artists come from Scandinavia, and relate that to the relatively small population. I think it's really, really fascinating to see how people grow up there with this, and it's just baked into the culture. So everybody's just sort of like part of music. And as I'm thinking about your company, your Oeksound, your plugins have, at least in my opinion, and I think you would echo it, there seems to be a desire to solve problems as opposed to create another LA2A, or that might be sort of like seen as low-hanging fruit, right? Oh, let's do that. Let's do an SSL, or let's do that. All that's all very good, but the products that you guys have are a little bit more on the inventing of things, I would say.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like the mindset? Or?
Yeah, a very kind of clear approach would be to say that you can't create a analog hardware unit that would do what our products do in that sense, but you can emulate analog hardware with software. I think that just has something to do with our age. We didn't grow up on tape. We didn't grow up on, I started using probably Cubase SX3 when I was 13 or something. So I was DAW first, I was computer first, and I had not really used hardware compressors before I started at the university, at the academy. When there, it was something very unique and special to use hardware equipment, and I loved it. But at the same time, every evening I went home to my home studio. I had no plans of getting like analog hardware. I did not have that kind of money. I could dream, of course, about it, but I tried to do work without access to that and to see if that is even possible. And turns out it was, especially back then in like, this was maybe 12 years ago, or 13, maybe 13, 14 years ago at most, when I kind of like really started actually doing gigs, audio engineering gigs on my own. And so I was probably 20 or something. And yeah, so I think through that, just the idea of, for us to kind of like start to continue on that emulate hardware thing that's been going on since then, and is very strong still. And I use them. I use plug-in emulations of hardware a lot, and I like the different sounds I can get out of them. But for us ourselves, it's not something that we're specifically interested in, because we're looking at what the audio engineerings constantly do, and if we can make that somehow easier. So for example, resonance control, finding search and destroy for resonances, peaking, room nodes or anything like that. That's like a immediate go-to for Soothe. And then you have getting something more upfront in your audio, getting more transients out of your audio. Then you have Spiff for that. And now with Bloom, of course, you kind of combine a lot of the things that you would do as an engineer when it comes to EQ compression, or just kind of like the first thing you would do when you approach a track and see. So hopefully we've also made something with Bloom that gets you a lot of the way faster.
Yeah. Jody, did you have something there?
Well, I was going to ask a question in terms of the education portion of your background, in that you went to university, you had music lessons going on, you did audio lessons, and you go home to a DAW. Were the lessons at university also in a DAW, or were they old school with tape and everything else, where you're talking about the idea of using the hardware gear and then going home and working on the DAW? Or did they just explain the concepts of how things like compressors, limiters, and EQs work, and then you just went home and applied it to the stuff you had on your DAW?
Yeah, so I think the program at the academy, back when I went there, was kind of a 50-50 between the audio engineer school, kind of just like a traditional audio engineer school where you learn recording, and we did not go a lot into tape. I think I might have done 1 or 2 lessons on tape or something like that, or running through. We definitely did recording sessions where we ran stuff through tape just to get that experience, but it was not in any way a focus point. It was all Pro Tools on big systems with great musicians, great microphones, great preamps, and in great rooms. And on that, and then the other half of the program is much more composing, being creative, and a lot of the things are in electroacoustic music, so which blends between free modern music, modern classical music, and electronics. And we got to approach that a lot, and I was very thankful to also get that experience, because kind of that pushes the boundaries of how you can create music and perform music. Some of the gigs we did were these 21 speaker constellations with 5 subwoofers spread out in different places and beneath the audience and stuff like that. And there was so much that we got to do at that school, and I'm like personally extremely grateful for all the experience I had there. Just being able to pretty much go through your bucket list of and also as an audio engineer of just saying like, hey, I want to record a big band. There you go. I want to record a symphony orchestra. There you go. I want to record a jazz ensemble. There you go. Metal band. There you go. And pretty much you had access to these projects and to these musicians, and there was always something new to learn. So as a recording engineer especially, I got really fast to a place that like it's simply just not possible anywhere else.
The interesting thing that you spoke to in that whole recollection of your education there is the access to the mics and the mic pre's. Those are pretty key to getting a good sound on the way in. Were there other elements to hardware gear that they allowed you to use, like compressors and whatnot, or was it strictly the mic to the mic pre straight into the interface in the DAW, and then you worked on it after?
We did have access to a few hardware units, and definitely started to understand the importance of that. What I've now learned after the fact is that how much you can tweak in the studio, especially in the soundcheck phase, to get the sound right on the way in. And I think just because of the pace of how we were doing it there, and also just kind of like trying stuff out, we didn't maybe I just didn't focus enough on that, while other students definitely understood that directly. And that's something that I might have understood later, because I was also like, no, I've been in the box my whole life. I can always fix it, like as soon as I recorded it. But then I'm not producing while I'm recording, and I should be producing while I'm recording. I should make the sound on the way in, right? And that's something I've understood, like, a long time later, way too late, I guess.
I think that's a common thing, though, because, like you mentioned, like we have the tools now in the box where we can, air quote here, solve all these problems that may arise, therefore not worrying about what's on the way in. But the reality is pretty much the other way around, right? We should worry about what's going on the way in. And if there are issues because of that, then we can use these tools to fix them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's a great way to actually put it, that tools like Soothe, for example, which is very much aimed at fixing a certain problem, gives me the safety of just focusing on the sound on the way in. It was like, oh, but that distortion is going to harsh up that signal so much. Are you sure you actually want to go that hot on the preamp or something like that? Yes, I'm sure, because I can always fix it afterwards if it was too much.
Yeah, it's a great safety net to have, but like you said, it's very easy that we forget that it's a safety net and not always a necessity. But we do have the tools, so yay us. Now, you mentioned something there also when you had access to all these bands in different recording situations. First off, obviously everybody records with 21 speakers and 5 subs, right? Who hasn't done that? Now, in all seriousness, with the bands that you mentioned, from like jazz ensembles to symphonies and progressive metal bands,
Yeah.
were these local bands that you got to record that had like a deal with the school, or was it just like this whole symbiotic thing that we know about these guys and they want to record and they bring them in? And how did that whole thing work? Because I think that's a great way to not only for artists to get their stuff out there and recorded, but also a great way to, with the networking aspect of it. You know, once you're done with the school, well, yeah, I know a first violin player is amazing in this, or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And I agree. I mean, that's where if I need string quartets, I have the people I know who I'm going to call because of that school, of course. And I have access to that. It depends on the project. I think that's the main thing. Of course, I'm not asking a symphony orchestra to show up for me. That would be, for me as a 20-year-old, that would be a kind of a lot. But no, there are concerts at the school that we have. It's in our like main concert hall building. A lot of the classrooms are there and the studios are there. And so I could sit in as an assistant on, for example, on one of the concerts and being able to record, be part of the recording process of that concert, for example, which of course had spot mics, had decad trees, had everything you need in order to get a good and probably on the way in having like 128 channels or something like that. And then me getting access to that project. Now, I'm not producing it. I'm not the main engineer there, but I have access to it and I can play around with it. I can mix it and I can show it to my tutor or my mentor or my teacher, and then being like, did I do anything wrong? Or like, did I do it right? Like, how do you actually mix this? Because maybe the next week or a few weeks later, I would have a jazz ensemble in, and those are usually from the school, those bands.
That's a real interesting background that you're getting based on all of that. Not only do you get to work on these projects as they're coming in, but you have access to other projects that have already been done by your fellow students. And I'm assuming that would mean an archive of access to projects that had previously been done.
Yeah, there definitely was. And it depends on the courses that we took, because we always had access. A lot of the mentors they took in to teach, or that they still take in to teach, are actual producers, of course, that have worked on big projects, and they might actually bring those projects to the students. And so we have access to these legendary projects, being able to look at them and try and, for example, mix them better than our mentors. And then we show up a few weeks later and then we compare notes or compare our mix to their final mix, of course. And so we have all these kind of different ways to go about. So yeah, studying at that school definitely taught us a lot, not only me, but I guess also Olli and everyone else that still go there. It's a great school.
When did it sort of shift for you, in a sense, that you wanted to be part of Oeksound today, or when you wanted to go into probably the more the technical and the creative of software? How did that happen for you, that sort of switch?
Yeah, me jumping on Oeksound happened quite suddenly but still naturally, and as we only had released the first version of Soothe, and you had posted something on Gearspace back then, and it immediately started to get a lot of good feedback. Now there was of course bugs to fix, as it is with the first plugin you ever release.
Sure.
It's not going to be perfect. So he wanted to focus on that, but at the same time he also was like, well, I've done the website, I've done the copy. He did his own copy protection back then for Soothe as well, and then
wow,
and then the web shop on his own was very much DIY. And of course, the plugin itself is not like a small feat to make, and it did take him a couple of years. And so, having done all that and having it out, and then needing to like start focusing on bugs and stuff, and at the same time marketing it. And making sure that other people know about it. At some point, I think he understood that, okay, this is starting to go somewhere, and I should probably not be alone doing this. And so we had a lunch.
Might need some help here.
yeah. And so we had a lunch actually at one of the university like cafes around Helsinki. So where you back then could get a lunch for like €2.60 or something like that. yeah, he was just talking about that, and my first reaction was like, well, you're not supposed to do all of that. You're supposed to, I mean, you're the programmer. You should be focusing on the bugs, and you should have someone else fix that. And they was like, yeah, you're probably right. And then we just went our own ways. And 2 weeks later, we had the exact same conversation at pretty much the exact same spot. And then he blurted out like, well, do you want to try? And I was like, what? Me?
Nice.
I had no background in marketing. I mean, I was an audio engineer as well, but I do know the audience. I mean, I'm a plugin lover, and nowadays I probably own 1,400 plugins or something like that, and I know what each one of them does, and so
Right.
I know that part. And so I thought like, well, I can probably learn on the job, and so that's when I pretty much started. And yeah, I started telling people about it. Started reaching out to these Grammy tier engineers, and got a lot of them interested. That's where it's pretty much started, and it's always been that way. It's always been me trying to reach out to the best I know in the industry and just hearing their feedback. It's not about selling something to them. I'm never actually asking anyone to buy something or anything like that. I'm really much trying to just make sure that we get feedback from these people whose feedback means a lot and actually pushes us forward to create better products.
That's great. I mean, because if you have somebody that does it for 8 to 10 hours a day, and they come across all of these issues that you're attempting to solve, and if they have input or thoughts about it, I can't imagine that being any more. It's got to be really invaluable when you get that kind of feedback, as it were.
Absolutely.
So you release Soothe. That's the first product coming out. Then how early do you guys get going on Spiff? And what was the impetus of that, and why Spiff?
Yeah. So, okay, just to get a timeline going, Soothe came out in November 2016. That's what Ollie did on his own. I jumped on pretty much a few months later and just starting to handle maybe some outreach and started connecting and also doing some marketing stuff as well. There was another programmer who is now also the third partner at Oeksound. His name is Tommy Grön, and they've been working also already. I think he was also might have been helping out or just like following along while Ollie was making the first version of Soothe. Now Spiff is pretty much his idea, even though like we did it very much together while we were also growing as a company. So we had a few more programmers that came on and helped us out, but Spiff got released in 2018. And so it definitely took a while, but we knew that the main point of Spiff was to handle spit. So mouth clicks, mouth clicks and in vocals and everything that happens when you have a pop vocal being recorded very close to the microphone, and then you put 3 compressors on and 2 Pultecs on, and then you like just crank the high end out of it, and you know what happens. And it was mainly just like an isolated issue of mouth clicks, but we very clearly at some point stumbled upon like, hey, but this is actually a great way to adaptively manipulate or control transients. That was then the next part. Okay, but what if we boost this material? And what if we also focus on like a lower range? And now we had this kind of super adaptive way of approaching transients, which for me, as a recording engineer, at least the way I think about it is, that's my main way of choosing how close I want something to be to the listener. So if I want something further away, I usually reduce the transients and maybe dip out some high frequency material, because that's what happens when you put a microphone further away from your sound source, right? Or then if I want it closer, I enhance transients and boost the high frequencies. Again, that's what happens when you put a microphone closer. So it's a nice way of just adjusting the distance afterwards with the tool. And I think that's a good way to approach it. But then again, I very much just use it for crazy stuff like maybe removing the close mics altogether from a drum recording and just having the ambience. That's something I've heard also being done is you record drums with 4 microphones, overhead, snare, kick drum, and then you don't have ambience mics. Well, you take the overheads and you take Spiff and you remove all the transient information, and then there's your ambience mics or your room mics. And then you can use that and you can squash that with your 1176 New York style, all buttons and compression, and you have that on a duplicated track. So it's a nice way of kind of like getting more out of your material if you want to.
See, this is why it's so awesome that we got you on the podcast, because both Jody and I have seen you at NAMM a few times, and the enthusiasm for what you can do with the gear is contagious. And it's like, oh yeah, but here, yeah, this is what it's supposed to do. But check this out. If I do this, and Jody is actually doing something now with Soothe that I think was 2 years ago. It must have been 2 years ago.
That 2 or 3 years ago.
So you do.
Yeah. When we stopped by the booth and you were explaining something to, I think, another person at NAMM, and then I probably asked you to re-explain it since we'd come in kind of in the middle of what you were explaining. It is now a very standard use case for me in a mix using Soothe to remove the resonances of other vocals, other instruments in the mix when the lead vocal is going by using sidechain.
Yeah.
It changed the way I mix almost literally overnight, in that instead of doing the entire mix to a bus for the music aspect of things with all the instruments and another bus for all of the vocal aspect of things, I'm now bus mixing every group: drums and percussion, bass, guitars, synthesizers, other instruments that might get lumped together, all lead vocals to one bus, and then all backing vocals to another bus. It is amazing how much of a difference using Soothe in that aspect alone can change a mix, and the ability to get a vocal to sit without having to do crazy compression all the time, which is what a lot of people are doing to get something to sit, as you say, right up in your face. It's a particular sound. Some people like it. I'm not one of those people that care for 10 compressors on a vocal, although I've tried that technique and trying to smash the bejesus out of all of them. The Soothe technique that you explained literally was like, like the raining down of like a very heavenly way of doing something, and it worked great.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Yeah, I do use that. The funny thing about sidechain and Soothe 2, and because that was the next part then. After Spiff, then a few years and we released Soothe 2 at January 2020. It was actually that sidechain was probably one of the last things we even thought about adding. The sidechain feature was almost an afterthought. We definitely was like, yeah, there's some really good stuff you can do that, but we haven't really had time to test all the possibilities with it. But let's just put it there because I think it's going to be good. And now everybody uses it, and like people can't stop talking about actually having stuff react to each other that way. It's lovely to hear that you found that useful.
Very useful. It's interesting that you say so many people are really into that sidechain feature, and it makes me wonder, what other possibilities am I now missing?
Well, yeah, if you really, I can really go into some kind of hidden or secret things. I don't know, because the way we split the signal up with these tools, so Spiff, you get your transient material through the delta material. Now that means you can process your transients separately. A lot of these tricks are like duplicate your track, so one with Spiff on and one, or actually both with the same instance of Soothe or Spiff on, put one of them in delta, which means that they're going to sum up identical to before, right?
Okay.
And then when you have those things split up, so with Soothe, for example, you have the signal that is where your resonant material is getting carved out, and then you have only the resonant material. Now, how do you want to process your resonant material separately? There are a bunch of different things you can do to your resonant material. And think about that. You can saturate, you can distort only your resonant material, maybe only your non-resonant material. Everything is resonant in its own way, but like it's not the most resonant material. For example, you said you're using Soothe for S's. Now, if you want extreme control over your S's, you take that delta signal, you take Soothe that you use for de-essing, you duplicate, and you have that track and you put that into delta. What are you going to hear there? You're going to hear the listen function, of course, of a de-esser. So you're going to hear this. Now you can put whatever plugins you want after this And you can put another soothe if you want, of course, but you can compress it, you can saturate it, you can pretty much have complete dynamic control over only that delta signal. And then you put it back together in the end. You reintroduce that material back to the signal that does not have the resonances in them. And I really recommend playing around with, for example, distortion and saturation on only the delta signal and then bringing that back into the original signal, because that has a completely different effect than putting distortion on top of your whole.
The whole track.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. And the same thing with like transients. Do that with Spiff and take your transients and saturate them, or do whatever you want to do with them. Like if you want them to be like softer, then a saturator would be nice. And then you bring them back together with the original signal. Or only put, if you need reverb, don't put reverb on the clicky transients. Only put reverb on the stuff that doesn't have any of the click, and have that fed into plate reverb or a chamber or whatever you want to be reverberated. So again, that's a neat way of thinking about both of them, Soothe 2 and Spiff. The thing it's targeting, what if I split that up and process that separately for a while and then bring them back together?
Yeah,
That just changed the way I thought about some of the reverbs I've just done on some recent remixes.
you got to redo it now,
I
Jody.
might have
Got
to
to
redo it since they're not released yet. I might have to go redo that. Oh, man.
I actually do that a lot. Like feeding into a reverb, I usually put Spiff in cut mode before going into the reverb, just to make sure that I'm not like, we don't need that clicky transient information.
All the plosives,
feeding. Yeah, the plosives or the clicky stuff going into reverbs with drums or with plucky synths or with guitars or anything like that. So it's nice to have that behind just one knob, the depth knob, of being like, okay, how much of that do I want to be fed into the reverb? Or do you have anything of that? So it's kind of like an attack knob for your reverb, but it's only targeting your transients and letting everything else through.
Oh, the joys of having the benefits of growing up in Finland right now, the creative aspect of music. I wish I had that in my background. Damn it.
No.
That's just fascinating, because when you get somebody, you have to talk to somebody like yourself, where you get your hands dirty with these tools, obviously on the daily, having such an intimate knowledge of what they do, obviously. But then hearing about all these, air quote here, like unintended uses perhaps on the surface, where it's like, yeah, have you tried this? Do this. And it's like, oh my God, this is so cool. And it's really just the imagination that puts limits on what it is that you can do with it, if we think about audio in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's really, really cool. Obviously, we talked a little bit about Spiff and Soothe too now, but you do have a new plugin that was just released, or at least announced at NAMM of this year, of 24. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea behind Bloom?
Yeah, absolutely. Following up Soothe 2 is high pressure because that really kicked off and that became really popular. And so we definitely thought a while about it. Guess it looks like we thought 4 years about it, which is kind of right.
An M76 clone, that's where you always go, right? Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So we were kind of between doing another L2A and Bloom, right? So no, we knew that we had to kind of like follow up Soothe 2 with something special and focus in on the stuff that worked with Soothe 2, right? We did a lot of things right with Soothe 2, and we're so happy that it's being adapted, like people are adapting it, and just everybody has started to use it. Coming back to that and going like, okay, what is something else with the technology that we have available? What is something else we can approach that would still help as much or maybe more people than what Soothe 2 did, for example? And it really needs to be kind of a no-brainer, as with Soothe 2, for example. And so we looked at what technology we were dabbling with. And at the same time, we thought about what are some things that all audio engineer, all mixing engineers want. A lot of people talk about warmth. We did some research into what is warmth, how can you achieve warmth in audio, and stuff like that, which led us onto overtone series again, and how overtone series are distributed over audio and different timbres, for example. Now, at the same time, we were also dabbling with presence, Okay, but people usually want something, upfront. We talked about that a few times. You can, of course, approach it through transients, but then again, there's always something for the whole tonal shape that has to do with something being more present. Now, both of these, talking about warmth and presence, has to do with the overtone series, okay, and how that is distributed over audio. We noticed that, okay, we're kind of like approaching the same thing here. What if we just did a plugin that does both of those and all of that? What we ended up making was what we call now an adaptive tone shaper. Now, we're calling it a tone shaper and not a balancing tool or anything like that, because balancing audio is not something we don't know better than you about what a balanced sound is. A balanced sound is not an objective thing. I know no better than either of you, like, what is the correct balance in your mix. And as a plugin company, to create a plugin that says that, yeah, this is going to create balance to the force or to your mix in any way, it doesn't really make sense. So what was super important to begin with is that, yes, the first approach of Bloom is to kind of balance out irregularities in your sound, but you're very much supposed to quickly start to shape it in towards the direction you want it. And it's going to push your sound into the direction where you want it adaptively. So all changes that are happening are dynamic. So essentially what's happening is analyzing the incoming signal. It applies corrections to the signal, so cutting and boosting, but all these cuts and boosts are dependent on the full signal. So it's looking at the full signal at the same time, and then adding boosts and cuts on different areas. And immediately after that, that's just we're doing one knob. After that, you can go and say, no, I actually want it to be warmer. And you bump up some low end, even more low end, or actually want it to be even more present, and you bump up the high mid, or you actually want it to shine and sparkle. You turn up the highs, and you're pretty much done. And it's going to constantly do these dynamic and adaptive changes to your sound in that direction, no matter what the sound, like the incoming sound, does. So it's very much interacting with the sound and more like reacting to it, and making sure that it pushes the sound in the direction you have stated with your parameter moves. A good way to think about it is that, yeah, it's a good starting point, but immediately this is the fastest way to get a sound where you want it to go in a very kind of transparent way, because you can boost high end with it and it's not going to sound shrill. You can boost low end to it and it's not going to sound boomy, because it knows when it's too much. So it's going to cut when there's too much, and it's going to boost otherwise.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that, because I've played around with this a fair bit, not as much as I would like it, and undoubtedly will do in the future. But one thing that I noticed, that extreme moves don't take it into like extreme territory, if you know what I mean. So it's like, just like you're saying, like, yeah, you can crank the snot out of the low end, but it doesn't get overwhelming in a sense. And the same thing with whatever band, like that, the most obvious one would be the high end, where it's like you can just get, like I said, shrill, but it doesn't seem to do that. And I felt the same way, even if you're cutting certain parts of the spectrum, right? It doesn't get like, oh my God, that just completely removed stuff that I didn't want it to remove, right?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated with it as well, because I know that there's a lot about it that I just haven't wrapped my head around yet, but they will probably reveal themselves. What about you, Jody? You've played around with it as well. What have you found?
I feel the same way about it as what you just mentioned. And one of the things that initially sparked in my head when I first saw it at NAMM was a comparison to, I don't know how popular this thing is, but the Gullfoss EQ, which they market as a balancing EQ, as you mentioned. I've used that particular plugin probably less than the number of digits I have on both hands, mainly because it just doesn't always seem to achieve the goal that I'm hoping for. And that's not a slight against Gullfoss. They make a wonderful balancing EQ, I guess it might be called. The idea with Bloom, I felt the same way that Chris just mentioned, in that pushing the sliders in various forms didn't seem to be really aggressive in either direction. The one that I had the most fun with, though, was the squash function.
Yeah.
And I could hear what it was doing, but as Chris said as well, I haven't fully wrapped my head around it just yet.
Yeah.
And I don't want to just push things around and not understand why it's doing what it's doing.
Yep.
Maybe you can explain a little bit of that.
Yeah, sure. And either in both ways, I think with Bloom, you're supposed to like push it in a direction and notice that, hey, this still sounds pretty good. In that way, we're actually like approaching what you might have done with hardware. You plug something in, you crank it up, and then you're kind of like, well,
a little too much,
down.
back off.
Yeah, exactly. A bit too much, and then you back it off, and there's that, but I do like the sound of this. And then you might move to your next one. And we really, really want to enable that and make sure that people approach it that way. And also with the squash, that you notice that like you can turn up the amount to like 7, and that's before the squash even does anything. And it doesn't really do a lot, of course, depending on the incoming sound, but it shouldn't do that much to your sound even then. And then when you push it towards the squash mode, and then just as a quick like tip there, always when you enter that range, just click set on both of on the wet trim and the squash calibration, because when you're in the squash range, you need to calibrate the gain staging for that.
See, I didn't
dynamic
be
thing.
right. Yeah.
I didn't do
Exactly.
that. I just
So-
let it squash. So
Yeah. Well, that's also good. I mean, if it sounds good to you, you're also very much allowed to just go with what sounds good, and that's always the way to approach everything when mixing. So, but yeah, squash. What actually happens there? These corrections that Bloom are making when it's analyzing the incoming signal. When you enter the squash range, we're starting to reduce the dynamic range of the whole signal towards those changes that I've been making. So in a way, if they've been super dynamic and super adaptive so far, so quite subtle, you're actually starting to force it to make those changes. And so you're kind of like really, really pushing it to become more that shape, I guess, that it's trying to do. But it's still reacting. It's still changing that shape and really reacting to the incoming signal. But when you start reducing the dynamic range, what you get is something that sounds a lot like and is compression. It's both upward and downward compression that's happening, depending on the move that it's making, but still reacting to the incoming signal. It's a very like unique sounding compression, and it can be very subtle, or then it can, if you really want to crank it, you can even like turn up the squash calibration and really push into the compressor even more if you want to. And then you can kind of like decide if you want that. And that's also, you hear a lot more what the attack and release parameters are doing then. So if you want to see how much it's targeting transient for a material with the attack parameter, or then with the release parameter, what I find it's the best way to think about it is like it's between these changes. If you want it to bring out what's happening in between, the shorter release time is needed. Or if you want it to only do broad stroke changes, slower release time.
Got it, yeah.
So that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, speaking about sort of extreme settings, one thing that I messed around with was on individual tracks on electric bass. I started with, actually, you had a preset in there that escapes me now, but it was one for the bass.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one of those things like, oh, holy shit, this sounds awesome. But it was one of those things where it was really bringing the bass up front without it, and evening everything out, just as you would expect with the extreme amounts of compression going on here. But it wasn't sounding like it was being extremely compressed. It was sitting at a level, and all the nuance of the track that was there was sort of really pronounced and brought the bass forward in a really pleasing way. Again, without making it sound like it was squashed to hell. Right?
Yeah.
So
and then you
that
followed
was
it
one
up
of the,
with Spiff and brought it back.
obviously, as one does. No, but it was one of those things like, okay, wow, now I really start to see what this plugin can do. Yeah, I think that would might be my sort of go-to for bass, at least for a little while going forward here, because it was one of those things. It didn't sound extreme, but it had extremely pleasant results, shall we say.
Yeah. I think we have a preset in there called something like Motown bass and stuff like that. So I don't know if there was that one or
it wasn't that one. Actually, I'm going to do a little clicky here while we're recording.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring it up. Please continue to have intimate conversation while we do that.
Yeah. So I actually do love what it's doing to bass and being able to control dynamic over a broader spectrum, because obviously with bass, you kind of like need to adjust the sidechain on a compressor to make sure that it ignores certain frequencies and stuff like that. But in my opinion, why should it ignore? It should just compress different areas of your spectrum in different amounts, right? And make sure that you bring out the tone of, or the timbre of your bass that you want there. And I think that's a good way to approach Bloom as well with anything that you're mixing, is that if you find a sound dull, then you can whip out Bloom and see what it does to it. And you can explore alternate versions of your sound by just completely flipping the frequency existing in that audio. And so if you have a very dark bass, you can pretty much, if there is frequency content there, you can turn it into a super bright one. Or if you have a sample that just feels very lo-fi, if the frequencies are still there, you can turn it into a super hi-fi sound and just quickly check like, well, what if this would be a brighter sound? Or what if this would be a warmer sound or a more present sound? And I like thinking about Bloom that way, because now I find myself skipping a lot of EQ, a lot of compressors, a lot of multiband compressors, a lot of these stuff that I usually, when I kind of like hear a sound in my head, I'm like, okay, for this sound to become that sound in my head, I need 2 EQs, 1 multiband compressor, and then a compressor at the end, and maybe some parallel stuff going on as well, and maybe some mid-side. Now I just whip out Bloom and I put that on, and then I was like, okay, there we go. Yeah, this is the right direction. And then I might add something later, but at least I got like 85% of the way with Bloom.
Right.
Yeah.
Immediately.
In regards to that, what is the breakdown in terms of its compression capability? You mentioned multi-band compressors and multiple EQs. Is there a fine line, or is it literally just dependent upon the individual frequency, and what's the Q on that?
The Qs in Bloom, especially, I think you can always think very, very broad strokes.
Okay.
Maybe very fine on the analytic. All our plugins you can split up into these stages. You're analyzing the incoming signal, and then you're processing the signal. So the first stage is always analyzing the signal. That's kind of like where our magic comes. Like we look at it and understand stuff. or our plugins look at it and through very, very much testing that we've done, we start to understand what you want to do with it, and then we offer doing that, or the plugin offers to do that, and then you can adjust how much you want it to do it and where you want to do it more or less. And that's the processing side. Now on the incoming side, so we're making kind of those assumptions about your audio, but then with Bloom, for example, it's a very, very full-on broad strokes shape that it's adapting. I think thinking about bands and thinking about cues is not helping to understand it when you can think about your incoming signal as one full shape or one full audio, and then just approaching it as that. And that's the same thing that goes with compression. When you're in the squash range and that shape is being done, and that's a shape that's constantly moving. So you can't even think about it as one target or one shape, because this is kind of like following a target that is constantly moving.
Right.
And so what is it? Can you even have a target that's constantly moving in that sense? So it's not trying to make everything into one thing. It's constantly reacting to the incoming signal and trying to adapt to what is happening to the signal. Yeah, it's many people try and approach it as if it's a multiband compressor, because we need a reference point, right?
Sure.
We need something to kind of like
and that
look
was
at
the
and be
reason.
like, but is it? Yeah, exactly. So it's a very good question.
Right.
Yeah, it is a very good question, and I wish I had a very easy answer, but throughout our kind of testing and also doing what, for example, what Soothe does, would you call Soothe to a dynamic EQ? It's like, well, that would simplify Soothe to, but in a sense, well, yes, if you have 1,000 dynamic EQs that just decide on their own what to do, yes, then it's a dynamic EQ, or
Sure.
then it is 1,000 dynamic EQs that decide on their own what they're supposed to do. And now you have a multiband compressor or an EQ and a multiband compressor that just decide, or many, let's say again 1,000 of them that just decide what to do, and then you can tell it where to go. So I think that's probably a good way of thinking about it. Very similar to Soothe too, actually.
Okay.
Well, I think it's fascinating and interesting, for want of a better phrase, perhaps the challenge also for the user, because we now have to, or probably definitely encouraged to think about the tools in a different manner, as opposed to like, okay, I know you're used to thinking about audio this way and the way it processes things, but this is different because like you said, it's constantly tracking the incoming signal, and not just for a threshold or a static EQ. It's doing it in a lot of ways continuously. And I think, speaking for myself here, that can be one of the things that it takes me a little bit longer to kind of wrap my head around it, what it's actually doing. But I think it's fascinating to have these tools that are doing just that. This might sound negative, but I don't mean it that way at all. But to have a completely sort of digital mindset when it comes to solving problems, right? That it's, you said at the top of the podcast here, you said that you could not make a hardware box of what it is our plugins do. Right? So I wish there was more of that, I guess. But I think it's the challenging of a little bit of how we think about it as a user. I think that, you know, because today, I mean, we talk about so much as an industry about everybody wants a quick fix, but everybody also wants like a Neve console or whatever, you know? So it's sort of straddling both those things, but ultimately we're making audio that's going to sound pleasing to people, hopefully.
Yeah.
So the more tools we have, I guess, I don't know if there's a question in there somewhere, but it's just an observation that I made.
No.
I don't know. It just challenges the user a little bit of the mindset, but once you wrap your head around that, as we talked about Soothe here, it's like you could do so many different things with it.
Yeah, it does resonate a lot with me, the way of thinking. In general, just to look at these, whether it's hardware, whether it's plugins, or whatever we like to use it, hopefully, as audio engineers, we like to use the stuff that makes our music sound good or sound better in the end. So let's start off there. Do you use a hardware because someone else used that hardware back in the day? Well, yeah, that might be a small reason, but I hope that the main reason you use that hardware or software is because it makes your music better. And when you turn that knob, you like what it's doing. And so we try and make plugins that works very, very much the same way. You turn that knob, that big knob, and you you understand what it's doing. Maybe you don't know how it's doing it, but you understand what it's doing, and you like it, or you approve with it. Or then you see where you need to kind of adjust the other parameters immediately. And we really, really try and make that very clear. But in the end, if you look at Bloom, we're not telling you anything about decibels, about the changes that it's making.
Yeah.
We're not giving you that kind of information. And we actually had prototypes that showed more to the users when we were trying stuff out, and we had different versions of some really, really early versions of Bloom. And what we notice is that people get scared when they see the changes that Bloom is making. If they see them,
I believe it. Yeah.
If they see them visually, as like on a similar way as with Soothe 2, for example, where you have this big graph and then you see what it's notching out. In Soothe 2, you kind of need that because you want to see, okay, I'm doing 6 decibel notches there. 6 decibels is quite a lot. Maybe I don't want to do that much. And you can react to that. Now with Bloom, we wanted to take this approach of, hey, turn up and see what it does. Does it sound good? Do you like it? Okay, go on with your life. You don't have to question it. It's fine. If it sounds good, it sounds good.
Yeah.
Just move on. And so what we noticed is that when we had versions that showed less, people felt a lot better using the plugin, and also made better musical decisions than when we had, for example, a huge graph interface of what Bloom was doing. And also if you had like these bands, people started to be like, well, can I get like just this frequency and have it to do just boost 3 decibels over this frequency? Well, that sounds a lot like an EQ. Why don't you just use an EQ?
Right. Yeah. It's very true. Obviously, you guys have proven it. But we talk a fair bit on the podcast, Jody and I, about not being afraid to make extreme moves if that's what it calls for. But it seems like we have something innate in us like, no, I shouldn't have to boost 12 decibels at 8K. You know what I mean? Maybe your track calls for that. Right. So it's fascinating to see that you gave people fewer readouts, because I caught myself doing that. Well, it just gives you a number, right? You're boosting this much and it's a value. It's like, okay, but what is that value? You know?
Yeah, we call it magical Bloom units.
There you go.
There's the answer.
MBUs for short.
Right. MBUs. That's awesome. We're gonna have to steal that, Jody. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, it's everybody's free to use that, but again, like that's very much true. It's just a number for reference to remember that. Well, last time I used this plugin, I was on 7 on that one, and I really liked how that sounded on that bass. So I'm going to put it on 7 again. Oh, that sounds good. Or maybe I want to do even more this time or less. So yeah, that's a very good point. And also, like going back to consoles, when you mix on a console, and if you're really comfortable with mixing on a console, you just put your hand there and you turn up.
You start turning. Yeah.
You start turning, and then you stop turning when it sounds good.
Right.
And you have no clue how much you just boosted or removed. Usually,
right.
Like you kind of have maybe a kind of some idea, but you don't really care, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then when you look at it, it's like, oh, that was 15 decibels at 12K.
Right.
And if it sounds good, it sounds good.
There is an interesting observation right there. That is the primary difference between mixing using either a controller or a console, or in the case of what just came out not too long ago from SSL, the 360 series with their UF8 and their UC1 and whatnot, where you can manually manipulate a knob. Whereas when you are in the DAW itself using a mouse, you are seeing exactly how much you're moving with actual numbers that are supposed to represent exactly what the move is on the knob. And I agree with that sentiment that when you are mixing on a console and you reach for a knob, you just turn it until you hear it. But when you are doing it with a mouse, you're overly conscious, at least for me, of how many units you've moved in decibels. And now I'd like to start thinking in MBUs.
It's a very freeing way of thinking about stuff.
Sure. I don't disagree with that. And thinking strictly about whether or not it sounds good, that's generally always been the primary goal of a great mixing engineer. Move the knobs until things sound great. Of course, that is a subjective matter. And it's interesting how you're explaining the workings or the inner workings of Bloom, because a lot of guys will get really into the inner workings of the gear. They'll read the manual, they'll understand what the hardware is supposed to be doing, how it's doing it. And obviously with hardware, you have components that can only deal with so much. And when you get into the digital realm, those slices can become way smaller in terms of how much you can affect in the sound. That's why I had posed that question of how Bloom is treating the sound. Obviously, I understand that it's treating the sound as a whole, but for other people that don't understand how much of it it's extrapolating, interpolating, and manipulating, it might be easier to think of it in terms of things like Q and the amount of decibels and whatnot. And to wrap your head around MBUs is a new way of thinking, for one. Obviously, playing around with it, the more I get to play around with it and the more I read the manual, the more I'm going to start seeing the creative uses that could happen with Bloom. Much like listening to you speak, giving a PhD talk and using Spiff and Soothe too. And I suddenly use it in mixing and it becomes a go-to method of what I'm doing.
If anyone's interested in kind of how the background before all three of our plugins, it's not like a big secret that there are plugins out there that focus on FFT processing, like fast Fourier transform. And I think that's something that I think many people understand that are behind these kinds of, it's not something unique to Oeksound at all. Like there are a lot of plugins out there that focus on that. You talked about Q and like how fine-tuned. So F15, essentially, I'm not an expert at all at this subject. Our DSP programmers actually are probably some of the best experts in the world on the subject. In a simple form, you take a signal and you can reconstruct any signal with sine waves, right? So you can make any signal out of sine waves. But like now we go the other way. We take a signal and we deconstruct it into sine waves. And so we know exactly what each one of those sine waves, where it is, at which point in time. And then we approach the signal that way, so that the smallest possible building block to approach a signal is that sine wave. And then we have stuff like latency and buffer size and bit and blocks and buckets and sample, and like how many samples can we process at the same time. And that these are the restrictions we're working with then later when we try and make something that at least feels real time or even goes down to low latency with these processors. But yeah, it's just to add on that it's still a very, very good question. And I think that's the best way to kind of read up. If somebody wants to go into the manual and look at the individual components of a plugin, I think reading up on FFT processors is probably the best way to get the most out of it.
Very cool. One thing that we haven't really touched on, and I tried both approaches here, so I've been messing with Bloom the last week or so. The original intention as a full mix or a sub mix used to put it on there, or individual tracks? Because like I said, I tried both. Just curious to see what your recommendations are. Yeah.
Again, if we want to talk, I find myself always going back to kind of a mindset answer. So here's my mindset answer. So first, of course, you don't know when you need a plugin. So if you download a trial or you're trying it out, you're going to need to put it on a bunch of different stuff and see what it does, right? Just trial and error. If you read the manual, if you read our website and you see how we approach it and say that it's an adaptive tone shaper and it fixes irregularities or has you explore completely alternate versions of your sound, you take that and then, okay, when do I hear that on the audio that I'm manipulating? So in my case, when I hear that I need Bloom, that's when I use it, right? But first, we need to get to a point where I hear that. I would definitely recommend starting off putting it on full mixes and buses and stuff like that, just because you hear a lot more of what it's doing. And immediately when you hear that, you're going to start using it a lot earlier in the chain, because you're kind of like, oh, now I hear it, now I get it. So I'm going to put it there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there.
Until your computer craps out.
Get to a point. Yeah. Well, it's not... Our computers are quite like, they have a lot of processing power nowadays. I mean, I guess the M1s. I know not a lot of people have those yet, but the M1s, 2s and 3s are starting to be
pretty
quite
potent.
Good.
Yeah.
So I think we've been running sessions with like easily like 120 Blooms and Soothes and stuff. So it's.
But what sample rate are you doing that at?
One of the tests we'd done was actually at 96. So.
And how many tracks?
Yeah. I think like at instances, it was, I don't have the exact numbers, but at least 60 and
that's a lot.
Maybe, yeah. But of course, as soon as you start putting other plugins next to them and on the same, and then they start kind of like, it's the intricacies of how DAWs work it's crazy. But going back to that question of like where to use it, I think about Soothe the same way. Everybody asks, well, do you put it first in your signal chain or do you put it last on a vocal, for example? I put it when I hear the problem.
Right. Yeah.
And so it might be that the rest I hear it. Usually if I put it early in my chain, I'm compensating for something the microphone technique, the idiot recording engineer did, and then or what the singer did, or if the singer sang in a specific style or range or timbre that didn't fit the microphone. If I hear that immediately when I'm pulling up the project, I'm going to put Soothe there. Then I put my processing chain on it. And then maybe I just added some high end or anything like that. And then I notice a problem again that's perfect for Soothe. Then I'll put another instance of Soothe, but it's for a completely different reason, right?
Right.
And so just always just going through via your ears. But then again, yeah, you can't from the beginning understand where you should put it. So that's where why you should put it on everything. And I really recommend just putting it on complex material first and just hearing everything that it does and is trying to do. And then you start understanding, okay, but if I put it earlier, I have more control over this and this and this and this and this. And then I still actually keep it. It's a wonderful master bus compressor and processor in general. Just adding some small tonal shaping at the end that is adapting to the dynamics and everything. I just love how it sounds on master buses, and that's something that we also noticed that a lot of beta testers were doing, which is scary because a beta. We told everyone that this is a beta version. Like, it's not supposed to work perfectly, and you're not supposed to use it on. You're not supposed to use it on actual work.
Right.
But then they loved how it sounded, and then it's like, oh, now my client needs, I don't know, Atmos stems of this mix and stuff, and it's like, and we need to do it through this beta. No, you're not supposed to do it through the beta. Please use the stable version that we have out. And so, yeah. But we noticed that a lot of really, really big mixing engineers immediately started putting it on mix buses. And I knew that was going to happen for producers, just to get the demo like quickly in shape.
Yeah.
But immediately having mixing engineers do that felt really nice, because that's something we aimed for, of course. And we're super grateful that we actually managed to get it work so well as well for the mixing engineers.
We're on to something here. People are actually using it. And yeah. No, that's great. A couple of things that you said there that I think it's so good to hear, because you said you place it where you need it. And I think for people that are kind of just starting out in learning how to mix and their own projects and stuff, the question always arises of, well, where should I put my EQ? Where should I put my compressor? In what order? They're sort of like tried and true things that people tend to do. So many times, it's just where you need it. What are you hearing? What don't you like about the signal? Well, I don't know. Well, then don't put anything on it. You know what I mean? And it's sort of like, well, I have all these plugins. I got to make use of them. I've spent $29 on all these Waves plugins. But
Yeah.
sorry. But just listen first. What's the problem? Right, as opposed to just pulling everything up and assuming that you have to use this on everything. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and also having that template thinking of being like, well, I saw somebody use these order of plugins in this way, so I'm supposed to do that. You have completely different starting points when it comes to the audio that is running on that track, and you should, like, if you have a very similar sound, then it's really good to try out the same signal chain if you're actually going for it. If I'm like watching an Eric Valentine video and I see what he's doing, and then I'm just like, well, I'm trying to go for that sound and I recorded this very similarly. So then, of course, that's the best way. And then you start fiddling around the same. And then I noticed that, well, this works for me. Of course, not the exact same settings works for me, but if I have the same and I listen to his mindset as well, and then I try to approach it as he would approach it, not as he approached it exactly in the video, because that doesn't make any sense.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things. I know I sound like old man yelling at clouds here, but it's one thing that drives me crazy is like when people have presets in a compressor. It's like you get it from the factory and it's like, oh, here's a preset. Well, but it's always dependent on the source. It's like there's no, oh yeah, you should always have the threshold at -12. Well, no, it's like it depends on the source. So it's one of those things that I guess you could take it as a learning thing, where it's
exactly.
like, okay, maybe this is a healthy way of looking at it, and then go from there. But we tend to live in sort of like a preset world as well. When I think everybody's
quick fixes.
Yeah, quick fixes. And it's like, oh, just pull up this preset because, like you said, this is what Eric Valentine used. So it's got to work for me, right?
Sure.
Well,
yeah.
Assuming you have the same kick, but,
yeah.
you know. So anyway.
Actually, as on a note to that, with compressors, when I kind of like forget how fast the attack is on a compressor, how fast the release is. So if I'm putting a compressor on a snare drum, for example, I usually flip through a few presets to remember like at which range was I supposed to use the attack on this compressor. And then I usually find it just by flicking through presets. And then I go back to my settings, but then I put the attack somewhere around that range and I listen to that. Just a nice reminder for me to go to the presets instead of just opening up the manual and being like, okay, so 10 microseconds to 50 milliseconds, 2 maybe. Again, a place where those numbers doesn't mean anything. If you look at an 1176 compressor and what the attack and release is like, those are magical Bloom units as well. So
right. Yeah. Especially if you're, using a compressor that, going off topic here, but if you're using a compressor that is, like you said, an 1176, where people always tend to go, okay, slowest attack, fast release, that type of thing, right? Yeah. And then, okay, and then input and output is here. Even less on like an LA 2A, which is like, okay, gain reduction in level. But if you're using something that is more, let's say the stock compressor in Logic, for example, where you have all of these parameters, right? It can be a good reminder, I suppose, of like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have 0 attack when I'm trying to bring some life out of this snare, right? So overall, I still stand by my point. Same thing for like EQs in a sense. But anyway,
presets on EQs, that's weird.
Yeah, right, yeah. So pop vocal, yay, okay. Doesn't depend on the source at all, right? But again, here, I'm sounding like an old man just complaining. I think it, in some cases, can actually be a disservice for people when they're learning, because it's like, well, in preset from my favorite engineer, he had a boost at 6K. So there's got to be a boost at 6K, and not knowing why it's doing that. But
exactly.
Back to Bloom here. It's a plugin that certainly I want to dive into a little bit more, but I'm fascinated to do so because I like your stuff. I know Jody does as well. So it's going to be fun to see what it can do.
For sure.
I mean, some tricks to actually just add, because I gave a few tricks on Spiff and Soothe, that one way to actually approach Bloom, I really recommend like trying out filtering off the range of where you want the processing to happen. And that way you can use that, for example, as a high-end exciter. So you only target anything above 5K, let's say, and you really crank, you put it onto like 9 or a lot of squash happening there. Then you can always calibrate, so it's going to be at the same level. And then you can mix it in. You can boost, if you want, you can still use the band to even boost the high end even more. And then you turn down the mix to 0, and then you bring it back up to maybe, 5, 10, 15%. And then you suddenly have this super controlled high end. And because of its adaptive nature, when that S hits, it's going to ignore the S, right? Because that's the way Bloom works. You're telling it to boost high end, but when there's too much high end, it's not going to boost it then. It's only going to boost it when there's not enough high end. So having that approach to an exciter, where you would probably put in like an oral exciter, but then you might have a de-esser before your exciter because you don't want to feed it too much of that. And then you have like these chains again, and then you only you have to put your EQ there, make sure that it only targets a specific area. And then you have it on a separate track because you need to have it in parallel behind a single fader. Or then you put Bloom on, just adjust the range, turn the squash up, and then you mix it in. Doing these kind of tricks and doing that on the low end as well. So you kind of like only have make sure that you're very leveled on the low end and having it for low end compression, because it does a really nice job there to making sure everything is controlled. If you have it on a full mix, for example, and you have the kick and the bass communicating, working together, you can have a good focus on that. If you just focus in on that area and making sure that that's exactly where you want it, using again some squash and maybe mixing in. And I think that's always a good way to approach these drastic settings, is always like, go drastic, and then just use 5% out of it. That's completely fine.
Mix, blend to taste.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have 3 questions that we like to ask every person that we interview, and they are the same 3 questions. So if you've heard any episodes with interviews before, you know what they might be. If you haven't, here we go with the first question, and that is, what is your favorite piece of gear that you can't live without?
Boring answer and less boring answer. Favorite piece of gear that I couldn't live without. I would say a good pair of speakers. I've been so happy since I got them. I have the Amphion 118s.
Nice.
I'm using them with the Flex Bass 25 as well, but especially like the 118s, the Amphions, really changed how I listen to audio and how I approach it, and also how my music translates on other systems. I think that's super important, and I think that's why I'd probably say that. It's not a boring. The boring answer was actually my MacBook Pro.
Well, yeah, that's good, because again, it's like if you can't hear something, you're not going to be able to treat it right. So and make informed decisions about it. So that's good. All right, question number 2. What is the biggest lesson you have learned?
We touched upon using your ears, and if it sounds good, it's good. That's definitely one of them. But I think equally important would be to make sure you have fun with it, because if you're not having fun with it, something's wrong and you need to readjust.
It's good. Jody, want to do number 3?
Advice that you universally give others.
You're actually thinking about the answers there. I kind of like this.
Yeah, because they're really good questions. And I'd say take more breaks.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes, take more breaks.
Rest your ears. Very cool.
All right, it's time for our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, initially, I'm really, really tempted to be pandering here and say Bloom, which should get an honorable mention. So now I've said that. I do want to bring up, I recently got a new interface, and I switched from another provider, and I had some issues with them. So I wanted to actually pick my Apollo Twin that I just got. Jody, you've been singing their praises forever. So I needed a new interface. And so far, it's the dog's bollocks. It's been working really, really well. It's been all the issues that I had have gone away. So I have to say the Apollo Twin Mark II is what I have. So that's my find for this Friday. Jody, what have you got?
I'm going software-based, and I'm going piano-based. And what has happened is the Ivory 3 German D as an upgrade to that piano. It is a very amazing sounding piano that comes in a rather large format. It requires 42 gigabytes of disk space. It's huge, and it requires an SSD in order to be able to play back in a not so clicky and glitchy manner. If you are in need of a really amazing sounding piano, Synthology's Ivory 3 German D piano.
And just imagine, because then when you get your MIDI 2.0 controller as well, you'll be good.
Oh yeah. Hannes, do you have a Friday find for this week?
Yeah, well, I've been focusing a lot on our own release. I haven't really been able to follow along, but yes. Well, first, to just kind of echo Chris there, I do use an Apollo Twin always when I travel and write and produce with people. That's my go-to. It's been so good, and especially when I get to have my monitor chain for my artists as well, and they really enjoy singing through that console with the plugins. But I think on the software side, a company called Slate & Ash that create these really good looking instruments. I think one is called Spectres, which is kind of like a granular synthesizer. And then they have one called Landforms as well. And these are just gorgeous sounding and looking instruments. So Slate and Ash, really recommend people check them out.
Fantastic.
I'm unaware, so I got to check those out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Hannes, we'd like to thank you very much for kindly coming on our podcast and talking about not only yourself, but as well Oeksound and the lovely plugins that you guys create.
Thank you for having me.
For sure.
Yep.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this awesome podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the name Bloom, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Thank you so much, Hannes. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have an awesome day.
Thank you.